Hello, my name is Max. I have Asperger's syndrome. This video is the third part of a series of videos where I address the various symptoms of AS and give vivid examples of these symptoms from my own life. Briefly, before we begin, in case you haven't watched the first or second video and are not inclined to, refer to the description box for my modus operandi. It will only take a few seconds to read and might provide you with worthwhile context for the rest of this video and the series. For this video, I'll be addressing what is probably the most multi-dimensional symptom of AS. Social awkwardness. The topic is so broad and manifests in so many different forms that I might have to make a second video to include everything, but we'll worry about that later. Social awkwardness in Aspies, as we call ourselves, takes form in our blank facial expressions, how we often speak in one vocal tone without any emotion to animate our speech, how we may seem lacking in social or emotional reciprocity in our speech or our body language, how we often focus on one topic of obsession during conversation to the annoyance of our peers. These are just a few ways social awkwardness manifests in Aspies, when there are literally hundreds of potentialities. If you want to see how multifaceted social awkwardness can be, I recommend you click on a link I have placed in the description that will take you to an article titled Social Communication and Language Characteristics Associated with High-Functioning Verbal Children and Adults with ASD. You don't necessarily have to read the whole thing, but if you choose to skim it for a few seconds, take into account that almost everything in this list of characteristics are things that people like myself have to overcome in order to appear normal and gain the social approval of the world around us. Given the inherently tribal nature of human beings and the tendency to ostracize people or things they don't understand, Aspies are left with one or two choices in social situations. 1. Avoid social situations completely, or 2. Attempt to actively consider all of these symptoms and remedy them during the course of a conversation, which, most of the time, heightens our stress beyond acceptable levels. Most of the time, when we attempt the impossible balancing act known as the second option, we fail. I'd say, without exaggeration, 90% of the time it's a failure. So naturally, when we fail that often, and almost every time we fail we are rejected cruelly, we avoid social situations entirely. Therefore, Aspies find themselves constantly in the middle of an existential crisis. Can we survive in a world that doesn't seem to want us? That might sound hyperbolic, but follow me here. Consider the fact that human beings are social animals. Our ability to construct a civilized society and get along with each other is by unconsciously agreeing to a sort of homogeneous social game. That social game is built around the majority of the human race that do not have Asperger's, or other health issues for that matter. People who we call neurotypicals. That social game is not for people with AS. One reason why is as follows. What most neurotypicals don't consider is that every time they interact with another person, there are unconscious functions at play. Now what do I mean by this? Well, you know the saying 90% of communication is nonverbal? Well, that's actually truer than you think. When neurotypicals interact with each other, their tones of voice, their facial expression, their body movement, the times they start talking and stop talking, these are all things they don't consider. They just do it. These things are so evolutionarily ingrained into the unconscious action of neurotypicals that they don't have to think about it. It's like when you look at a glass of water. You think to yourself, I can drink out of that. Well, why do you think that? How does your brain come to that conclusion and not something else, like throwing the glass of water across the room? Well, to put it simply, it just does. When it comes to people who have Asperger's, or neuroatypicals, as we call ourselves, all of the things that are unconsciously obvious to neurotypicals in conversation are not obvious to us. For example, when a neurotypical meets somebody, you might say, "Pleased to meet you." To a neuroatypical, it's not obvious that we have to do this. If you're a neurotypical, think about the example I just gave about the glass of water and apply it to this situation. When you meet somebody and you say, "Pleased to meet you," well, why do you say, "Pleased to meet you"? Are you actually pleased to meet them? A lot of the time, you just say it. As for neuroatypicals, we approach things almost purely logically and literally, like a mathematical equation. Social cues and pleasantries are not obviously logical to us because they are not like a mathematical equation. Can you explain why saying "pleased to meet you" works mathematically? No, it just works. Neurotypicals have constructed and adapted social cues and body language for millennia by testing what works best in a civilized society and eliminating what doesn't work via a trial by error. Unfortunately, for millennia, neuroatypicals were unintentionally left out of this process. Because we are not neurologically wired to adapt to this social game, Aspies have to fend for themselves in order to make sense of the world around them. Oftentimes, we make very naive assumptions about the nature of human beings at a young age, and when those assumptions are obliterated, it can be at best annoying and at worst traumatizing. For example, oftentimes Aspies assume that because peace and niceness are obviously preferred over chaos and rudeness, we don't need to say something as redundant as "pleased to meet you." If we learn later that we made somebody angry by not following those social dictates, we fall into a pit of existential confusion. What did I do wrong? Well, most of the time we probably didn't do anything wrong. Nevertheless, because of the way we present ourselves and how every element of our presentation is slightly off compared to that of neurotypicals, human beings tend to rely on their primordial instincts to ostracize the unfamiliar. Sometimes they do it subtly in order to not hurt our feelings, but other times they can be quite vicious. In order to illustrate how traumatizing social situations can be, I will provide you all with examples from my own life when social awkwardness reared its ugly head. Like I said at the beginning of this video, there are several ways social awkwardness manifests, and as a result, I could list hundreds of examples from my own life. For this video, I'll just give a couple, and then do another video later where I address broader subcategories of social awkwardness. Upon getting my Asperger's diagnosis, I was instantly reminded of several examples from my life where everybody, from my peers to my family, rejected me for my social ineptitude. Let's recall the symptoms of blank stares and lack of emotional reciprocity. I remember as far back as preschool, my father would tell jokes or try to be lighthearted for my benefit, and I would just stare blankly ahead, not knowing that I was supposed to laugh or actively appreciate his attempts. Almost immediately after, he would say something like, "Get a sense of humor, they're free, you know?" Or when I have a blank expression, apparently when I stare blankly, I look like I'm frowning. When I do that, my father would say something like, and excuse my language, "You miserable fuck. What have you got to be miserable about?" Without exaggeration, for 20-odd years, I had to hear some variation of those two statements from my father and to a lesser extent from my mother. Some of you might be openly questioning how I responded to these statements. Well, I didn't. See, when you're a child and you're raised to treat your parents with the utmost respect, when they say things as cutting and cruel as that, you assume that they are telling the truth and that you need to improve. So even when they say these things, and on a subconscious level I feel like they're wrong, I have to internalize my rage and think about what it is that I did wrong. Because I had no conception that my parents would ever say something untruthful or purposefully cruel to me. That was how I logically perceived things at the time. Work situations are where things always got interesting. I remember when I was first hired to work as a meat cutter at a grocery store. On one of my first days there, my boss ordered me to shadow a fellow employee named Amanda so that I could learn my job properly. So I did exactly as I was told. However, it wasn't immediately obvious to me when I was supposed to stop following her around and do something else. She eventually got really annoyed and said, "Look, I don't need a shadow following me around, alright?" Confused by her anger, I said, "Oh, okay, what should I do?" She said, "Go over there and refill the styrofoam trays." I was confused, because the trays didn't really need to be filled. I surmised that I just had to look busy because it was an off day at the store, but how was I supposed to figure that out? Because of my social ineptitude, it seemed that Amanda viewed me as an insect that she had to work with every single day, buzzing around her head when she just wishes she could smack it dead. Whenever she could, she made her displeasure with my efforts known, finding every little thing wrong that she could as a form of catharsis for her misery. It got so bad that every time I got into work and I saw her, I would almost start to cry. I would think, what did I do to aggravate her? Did I do anything at all? My autism got in the way in almost every other job I've ever had. I remember I made a fellow coworker of mine at a chip warehouse really angry because I answered one of his harmless questions in a tone of voice that, to him, sounded subtly antagonistic. And when he got immediately angry with my response, I started to emotionally plead to him that I didn't mean to sound the way I did, and I was just responding to him. He was the nicest guy too, and I didn't want him to think I disliked him for any reason, or that I would act needlessly cruel towards him. And university, don't even get me started about university. That's a whole other video. But for now, I'll link to a video I did 3 years ago where having Asperger's syndrome was truly traumatic. Here's a sneak peek. I told a joke to a female group member that No sane person would ever find sexist or offensive. At worst, it was a bad joke, but that didn't stop her from finding a way to get offended. But the worst thing of all wasn't just the fact that I have had social misadventures. It was the fact that they have left me, to this day, with an unshakable paranoia. When you fail this much in social situations, we instinctively are on guard for the next failure and the subsequent emotional breakdown over our inadequacy. This paranoia becomes so intense that even when a specific social interaction seems successful, we puzzle over every little thing that we said, and every little thing that they said, and try to determine whether or not things really went well. After all, we've thought things have gone well in past situations only to have our perceptions brutally betrayed. That paranoia poisons any chance of good social or romantic relationships from developing, rendering us in a state of near permanent loneliness. If by chance that lonely cycle is broken by some angel of a human being who accepts our quirks and enjoys our company truly, we can be so grateful that some of us, like yours truly, break down in tears over our gratitude. To my fellow Aspies, if any of what I have said sounds familiar to you, I highly recommend you seek out a diagnosis. Don't lie to yourself about your inadequacies. Lying never leads anywhere good. You never get away with it. Coming to terms with your limitations, while painful, is a much healthier alternative to what almost happened to me. To my listeners who don't have Asperger's syndrome, instead of offering your sympathies, I'd much rather you share this video to spread awareness, or either of the other 2 videos I've done. Share it with somebody who might know an AS sufferer. That way they can save themselves from unnecessary trauma and live a much more fulfilling life. Before you go, I also want to direct you all to a test in the description box below called the Autism Spectrum Quotient. If you think you might have AS or know somebody who does, make sure the relevant person or people take this test. It's not an official diagnosis and shouldn't be treated as such. It's mostly just to help encourage people to seek out diagnoses so they can get the resources that they need. Until next time, my fellow Aspies, just remember this: you deserve to be happy.